Thank you very much. This is a paper about hackathons. So over the last, hackathons are not a new thing, but over the last couple of years they've been of increasing interest to the HCI community. There's quite a few papers, especially last year at CHI, about hackathons. For the uninitiated, what I mean by that is intense co-located sprints of activity, typically and originally around the production and maintenance of code. So where they become interesting for us, though, is that they are increasingly also being taken up by other organisations kind of beyond the technology sector, and they're being targeted towards audiences who don't typically attend hackathons. And they're also being targeted away from the production of code and towards other kinds of activities. And so to our minds, when they do that, they become essentially a kind of participatory design event, where we're engaging the public in thinking about the future of technology and thinking about how technology can be applied to a particular problem. And that to us is interesting because they have been quite successful. They've been quite good at engaging people and engaging them over often quite long periods of time. So we're very interested in what we can learn from these events and how they're being used, and then how we can feed that kind of back into the design and the configuration of our own participatory design events. So to study this, we attended a bunch of hackathons, 6 in total. All of them certainly still involved technology, but they were all also explicitly targeted towards a wider audience than just technologists and developers. So we took part as participants. We joined in the teams with people who we didn't know, and we participated fully. And the findings that I'm going to present today are based on basically our observations and field notes of the teams and our experience of being in those teams, and also interviews mainly conducted with the organisers and also some of the attendees. The 6 events that we attended are here. So the first is Code the City. So that was organised by a kind of open data group, and this was perhaps maybe the most traditional of the 6 events. So they were very interested in civic use of open data. This particular event was about local history. We also attended 2 versions of Cycle Hack. So this is an international series of events that runs every year, founded by a service design agency. So those events are about how we can sort of try and lower the barriers that stop people from cycling more and get more people on their bikes. We also attended something that was billed as a local democracy maker day. So this was a fringe event that was part of a larger event called Not Westminster. And basically that brings together kind of local government staff, local politicians, but also developers and designers, especially those who are kind of involved in working at a local government level and working on kind of civic stuff. Railway Codes was run by a railway museum, so they were very interested in finding kind of new ways to engage audiences with their museum and with their collection. And Self-Harmony was focused on self-harm and how we can kind of develop things that will support people who self-harm or sort of their friends and family and people who know people who self-harm. And that was actually run by a HCI group, and there was a paper about it last year by Natalie Burbeck. So I'm going to talk through basically our findings from those events, and I'm going to try and answer these kind of 3 main questions. So what did organisers aim to achieve? Because it's not the typically, or none of the events, it was the production of code or working prototypes. So if that's not what they wanted to get out of it, what did they want to get out of it? What roles did participants from non-technical backgrounds play? So although there were technologists and developers at most of these events, a large proportion of the audience were not. So how were they participating? Kind of what mediums were they working in, and what were they getting out of it as well? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about what difficulties are faced in appropriating this format, which is really designed around the production of code and ostensibly very much focused on that. So what are the kind of difficulties that arise when organisations try to appropriate that for a different purpose? So the first couple of points I want to talk about are really about what the organisations wanted to get out of it and what their aim for the events were. And maybe chief amongst those was public engagement and awareness. So they saw these as a way of engaging a new audience with a particular issue or a particular problem. So for example, CycleHack wanted to engage people in understanding why they didn't cycle, and then wanted to use that to inform policy. Self-harmony was particularly good at raising awareness around self-harm. I think a lot of us went into that event kind of not knowing very much about the issue, and we came out of it much more sensitized to some of the issues around it. I think the key point here is that although the organisers saw this as a kind of public engagement event, it was a public engagement event that was very dynamic and exciting and interesting and engaged people in a new way. So some of the organisers explicitly contrasted this with kind of workshops and sit-down meetings and the kind of events that they normally run in terms of how kind of interesting and dynamic it was. They said you want to be making stuff, you don't want to be just sitting around and sitting down and talking to people. The other major thing was network building. So they wanted to bring people together around a particular issue, maybe people who didn't normally see each other. So, again, at CycleHack, they had, members of the public, but they also had people from cycling charities and people from local government. The Democracy Maker Day, that had a lot of people from different councils who kind of developed groups, and actually those groupings lasted, they persisted from one event to the next. That event ran year after year, and certainly the one that I attended, there was already a group that had been formed the previous year. They continued working together that year, and actually I went back the following year and they were still kind of working together and still kind of just working in a low-level way on the same idea and just kind of kicking the ball down the road a little bit. So for a lot of the events, rather than the prototypes, these were seen as some of the main outcomes, and this was also, this kind of network building was also seen as one of the main routes to impact and actually bringing about a change and something that would last beyond the event itself. So those last 2 points really actually they share in common with a lot of more traditional hackathons as well. I think the main difference actually is that where network building and public engagement were important for traditional styles of hackathon as well, they were perhaps secondary to production of code. At these events they were very much primary. So where they differed more significantly was certainly in hacking in different mediums. So for a lot of the events we worked, although there were some people coding, we worked with a variety of different mediums. So we saw people knitting, we saw people building stuff out of cardboard and plasticine and low fidelity prototyping like that. We also saw actually a lot of production of content. So although somebody might come up with an idea for a system that they weren't going to build and remained hypothetical, what they did prototype was the content that would go into that system. So that included video in particular. So one of the ideas that somebody came up with was a kind of storytelling system for local politicians, but what they made rather than the system was videos of kind of local politicians going around and talking to their constituents. So those prototypes played very specific roles. They were kind of commonly used as props to illustrate ideas and to support discussion and to embody issues. So they weren't really seen as something that would be taken forward themselves. They were just seen, I think, as something that allowed them to have a discussion, and certainly like at the Democracy Maker Day, we made almost nothing. Actually, one of the team members was kind of away, kind of building something in the corner, but actually for the rest of us that was just a kind of tool for us to kind of talk through some of the issues that arose around that prototype. As I said before, most of these events had a mix of kind of coders and non-coders, so something we were very interested in was how they worked together, and how sort of people who, when something was actually being coded and developed, how people who couldn't participate in that were still able to take part in the team. And I was often, although I have a technical background, I was often filling kind of that role myself, and that kind of variety of forms. So. At Code the City, which was the kind of open data history event, there was a large group of us who were working on producing an open data set. So we were kind of transcribing, I think it was a 1930s business directory of all these kind of businesses in the city we were in. And the idea then was that some of the other participants, the developers who were working on various kind of systems, like VR systems, things like that, that they could then take the data that we were producing and feed it into their system. So between us, we were kind of generating the whole thing. One of the other important roles that that they played was in providing unique knowledge and inspiration. So at Railway Codes, for example, in the Railway Museum, we were provided with all this material which was seen as a bit lackluster. It was scans of train tickets, or footfall data for train stations. But we had these couple of train enthusiasts who were at the event as well, and they were able to sort of tell us much richer stories and provide inspiration and point us towards interesting materials or interesting bits of history that could then be used to kind of spark off different ideas. Another way that emerged was at Self-Harmony, where there were a lot of people at that event who had themselves experienced self-harm. So by being able to engage with those people, they were able to kind of provide really lived experiences of what it's like to be a sufferer, and I think that for a lot of us that was very powerful and actually very moving to hear some of those stories and some of those people's experiences. There were some challenges though, as I said, was something else we were interested in was the difficulties in adapting that format for a new purpose. Certainly reaching an audience was pretty difficult. A lot of the organisers talked about the trouble that they had actually selling hackathons to people, and actually that word hackathon is not great, and it conjures up all sorts of things that maybe a lot of organisations don't want to be involved in. It was also difficult to kind of communicate the value proposition of what they were going to get out of it, and occasionally also to developers as well. When the topic moved kind of dramatically away from the production of code, they could sometimes struggle to recruit developers too. Certainly, though, something that was helpful was kind of responsive facilitation, and we saw this happening quite a lot, where organisers would kind of, in response to difficulties that maybe participants were having, they would quite rapidly reconfigure their event. So at Self-Harmony, it was obvious that people were struggling to form teams, so they introduced a kind of speed dating system quite very quickly. And again, at CycleHack, they were service designers and they had all these kind of service design tools that they wanted people to use, but when it became clear that people were responding to those, they ditched them quite quickly. And finally, I think there's been a lot of criticism of hackathons in the past, particularly around inclusivity and the perceived lack of inclusivity that a lot of these events have. And I think that a lot of the organisers were super aware of that, and actually they put a lot of effort into kind of tweaking these events and trying to make them a little bit more inclusive and a little bit more open. So some of the things that really worked well were kind of leaving the venue. So this is from CycleHack, and where people actually they were prototyping a kind of device that showed how much space you should give cyclists on either side. So they actually got these out and built them and went out and tested them on the screen. So I just want to finish now with a couple of general points, and I motivated this work by saying that I think we can probably learn a lot from these events, and that we can then feed back into the design of our own kind of participatory kind of design activities. I think for me, one of the kind of main takeaways from studying these events was the way that they gave participants free rein to shape their participation. They really chose kind of what mediums to work in, they chose what issues to engage with, they chose to what degree they wanted to engage with that issue. It became a kind of a participatory space that people could configure themselves. And this reminded us of a paper that John Vimes wrote a couple of years ago about configuring participatory design. And in that paper, one of their unresolved issues that they highlighted was the inability of participants to kind of configure their own role in the process. But I think that was actually something that a lot of these events did very well. So how can we, knowing that they're quite good at that, how can we learn from that, and how can we apply that to our own events? And I think for me, one of the most important things is that these events were rewarding in themselves. People weren't hoping necessarily to get anything out of it. They weren't hoping to get a working prototype out at the end of it. They weren't necessarily even hoping to change, policy or anything like that. They would just wanted to enjoy themselves. That people, most of these events, people just really enjoyed taking part in. So I think something we could be thinking about more is how we kind of create participatory design events that are intrinsically rewarding and that provide kind of better experiences for participants. But certainly if we want to try and import some of these properties of hackathons, I think it's also important that we don't import some of the problems that they have with them as well, and again, particularly around inclusivity. Fortunately, I think a lot of these events that we studied have done some great work in addressing some of that and figuring out kind of like how we might kind of make those events better and how we might avoid some of those pitfalls. And certainly, more flexible structures and more responsiveness to the participants was helpful, but also the wider variety of mediums that allowed people to work with whatever materials they were comfortable with. So on that note, I will say thank you for listening. I also want to say thank you to Zoe Prosser and Snook, who provided all the lovely images that I used. Thank you very much.
Please remember to state your name and affiliation before asking your question.
Hi, I'm Jules Maitland, professionally with Acriana Health IT Consulting Firm. Passion Project is the Build Cooperative, a non-profit here in New Brunswick, just next door. I have a question about managing expectations of participants. This is something that actually the kind of provincial government in New Brunswick are very keen to engage citizens in the design of their services, and they're not sure how to manage the expectations. You said these events in themselves are rewarding, but was there any messaging delivered to participants about what would be done with the output of these events?
Yeah, sometimes. So for example, CycleHack were very keen on documenting all of the outputs. So they really pushed everyone to document what they made, and that series of events has been running for about 5 years or so, and now they've built up this catalogue of different ideas, and they encourage people to pick them up as well. So some of them were definitely doing stuff to kind of help these things to actually be taken forward. We did see some issues with that as well. So certainly at Self-Harmony, I think people started off with this expectation that there were going to be these amazing new systems were going to be coming out of the hackathon, and I think over the course of the event, it was sometimes quite difficult when sometimes like the mentors and the people who maybe didn't have so much experience with this kind of event and the people who did occasionally kind of butted heads. But I think over the course of that event, actually they learned a lot about what could be achieved, which was maybe coming up with designs that are more sensitive and more sensitive to the issues and that kind of thing, rather than real solutions.
I'm Annika Wall from Lappeenranta University in Finland. I've run a number of similar events and I have some coming up, and you touched on this. It's the idea of the vocabulary being very off-putting. So even if you try and frame it not a hackathon but an ideathon or an appathon or a datathon, all of these thons, it still has that kind of idea of this kind of, I think which can be a barrier to some people, that it's maybe somehow technical. I wondered if in your work, did you get any insight in how to engage, or what types of vocabulary are more inclusive to people?
Yeah, I think certainly maybe people had more success with terminology around making that maybe emphasised more kind of craft activities and that kind of thing. In our own work, so we've kind of taken some of these findings forward and fed them to our own events. So we were calling them things like inventor days, which that kind of, because people know what an inventor is, right? Yeah. They have that image in their head of what inventing is, whereas they do have an image of what hacking is, and it's not a great image.
Sure.
So I think I guess it's about metaphors, isn't it, and kind of picking words that people can understand.
But invention and making, you felt were quite successful.
I think those ones worked, a lot better.
Yeah.